The Big Blue Railroad. A railroad that many have come to love for what it achieved and the stability it brought to the Northeast. It would turn dysfunctional railroads into a powerhouse on the East Coast, and it would also inherit a majority of the electric locomotives from Penn Central, and would make great use of them until Conrail would pursue a policy of diesel locomotives only. This is Conrail's electric locomotive fleet. My name is Jamie, and if you do like videos like this one today, give us a like and subscribe, as it helps out a lot. Next week's video will be about the initial electrification scheme of British Rail, beginning with the 1955 modernisation scheme, planning to drag British Rail into the 20th century, into becoming a new and modern railway, reforming and modernising the railways. So tune in into electrifying British railways next week. The railroads were collapsing in the Northeast. While government intervention with the formation of Amtrak in 1971, which took over intercity passenger services, had helped in reducing the losses, it just wasn't enough. Government regulation, labor cost, and more competition had contributed to the falling railroads. Penn Central, the sixth largest company in America, had declared bankruptcy in 1970. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes had damaged the already neglected Northeast trackage. This event would actually threaten other solvent railroads such as the Reading and Erie-Lackawanna. By 1973, Penn Central threatened to cease operations if they didn't get a bailout by the government. Penn Central was the largest railroad in the Northeast. If they ceased to be, it would cripple rail freight and passenger travel in the Northeast. The fear that this could actually happen caused the government to react very quickly. Initially, the plan was to nationalize it along the lines of the German Deutschbahn or British Railways. However, an alternative was put forward by the American Association of Railroads. This alternative was to create a company that was solely owned by the US government. This is similar to how Amtrak functions, where it is a privately owned company, but it is solely owned by the US government, similar to Crown corporations in Canada. This was a solution that was ultimately decided for Conrail. In the background, from 1973 onwards, the framework of Conrail was being written up, with the various lines they wanted to keep and remove from the plan, basically keep the profitable ones, and basically abandon the non-profitable routes. Conrail would actually inherit various types of electric locomotives. It would gain the full 10 E33s, 60 E44s, 3 E10Bs from Niagara Junction, 5 S2E, which were ex-New York Central locomotives, and 66 GG1s that were originally built from the original Pennsylvania Railroad. There would also be 2 prototype locomotives that would be inherited from Penn Central. These would be the EMD GM6C and GM10B. So, let's first get into those testbed locomotives. In 1975, the final plan would be unveiled. Conrail would consist of lines from 7 different railroads. It would consist of the Ann Arbor, Erie-Lackawanna, Lehigh Valley, the Reading, Central Railroad of New Jersey, Lehigh and Hudson River Company, and finally, Penn Central. This rail consolidation would be different, as would only take the designated lines from these companies, leaving the companies with assets. This meant that they could be actually financially solvent as well. The other lines that weren't picked up by Conrail would be sold off to other companies such as transport agencies, Amtrak, or other solvent railroads. This plan would be approved by Congress on November 9, 1975. Operations would finally begin on April 1, 1976. The government would own 85%, and the employees the remaining 15%. There was an uncertainty from both railroad executives and the man on the ground. Would this railroad be a repeat of Penn Central? Lehigh Valley chairman believed this endeavor would be a failure, saying it would always be unprofitable. Conrail would actually have to pick up the pieces from the decades of disrepair, repairing things from locomotive, rolling stock, and even the track it ran on. This era of Conrail would also be known as the Rainbow Era, as locomotives from predecessor railroads such as Reading and Lackawanna would retain their original livery, but simply be marked with a CR for Conrail. It was common to see 3 to 4 different types of liveries on a single freight train. On the electric front, it would actually be easier due to Penn Central being the only owner of electric locomotives on the Northeast Corridor. GM6C would be produced by EMD, who had made the iconic SD40, and it would also be made with the collaboration of ASA, who would be famous for building Swedish electric locomotives such as the RC class of locomotive, which would be used as the basis for the Amtrak AEM-7s. So why did EMD decide to build an electric locomotive? Due to the 1973 oil crisis, causing oil prices to jump through the roof, it caused a lot of existing railroad companies to reconsider their position on electrification. During this crisis, many railroads would actually start to consider partial electrification. To match this new electrification scheme, new locomotives would be needed. The GM6C would be developed as this new locomotive. So, the GM6C was designed to be a slow drag locomotive, one that would be designed to carry things such as coal and heavy tonnage. A single prototype would be built for these trials on the Northeast Corridor. These would have 6,000 horsepower and 126,000 pounds of starting tractive effort. For a comparison, these would have a similar performance to the DD840X Centennial locomotives used on the Union Pacific. However, the DD40AX would have 600 more horsepower, however, would have 13,000 pounds of less tractive effort. In terms of the build, the GM6C would actually look like a regular diesel electric, just like the SD40, to make it look consistent with other EMD products. It would use 2 of the 3-axle HTC truck. However, despite being a well-made product, oil prices would decrease to the point in 1976 where railroad companies were more comfortable using diesel locomotives. The urge to electrify had dropped, and interest in the locomotives and electrification would subside. The GM6C would have a higher powered sibling named the GM10B. This could be seen as a potential replacement for the GG1s on fast freight trains. The GM10B would have 10,000 horsepower, and despite having 6 less driving wheels, would have 114,000 pounds of starting tractive effort. Unlike the GM6C, which used conventional DC traction motors, the GM10B would use AC traction motors, giving them an incredible amount of tractive effort, despite having less wheels overall. In order for the GM10B to be smooth on curves, the center truck would move laterally, in order for the locomotive to glide along the rails. They would also be successful at the roles they were given. They would also suffer the same fate as its less powerful cousin, the GM6C, due to the lack of interest in electrifying main lines and due to high access charges on the Northeast Corridor. Due to this, no orders would be made, and only a demonstrator model of each would be built and delivered in 1976. Both locomotives would be quite different to older locomotives for having one simple feature: a notchless master controller. In conventional electric locomotives and EMUs, the controller would have normally 4 to 5 steps on DC overhead, and on AC would have 8 notches, such as on locomotives such as the E44. On the GM6C and GM10B, the controller would not physically be notched like a modern-day EMU. So, for these locomotives to still have multiple unit working, they would translate the master controller into 8 notches. So, if your controller was at the halfway mark, you would have notch 5 on the trailing locomotive as well. Conrail would gain both demonstrators months after being delivered and put them to good use. The locomotives were seen by crews as being quite well made and quite comfortable. Due to the high access charges on the Northeast Corridor placed by Amtrak, in order to deter long freight trains, as longer freight trains were starting to cause significant delays for other passenger trains, Conrail would actually start to avoid the corridor, either using longer routes or shorter trains, just to avoid paying the high fees by using the corridor. This would go on until 1981, where Conrail would cease electric operations, withdrawing all electric locomotives. The EMD electrics have been withdrawn in 1982 as well, and were to be sent back to EMD LaGrange facility in Illinois. It is unknown if they have actually been scrapped. From what I have read, some people have said they have seen them, and some people have said they have been scrapped. I cannot be certain. There has been no definite evidence whether they have been scrapped, so I'm just going to say it is unknown. One of the unique acquisitions during Conrail's era was the Niagara Junction E10Bs. These were small switcher locomotives, part of the steeple cab range from General Electric. As part of Niagara Junction's merger into Conrail, 7 E10Bs would be transferred. 4 would be stored and later scrapped between 1983 and 1999. 3 would be overhauled. They would also have a small DC pantograph to help them travel over point and third rail shoes. They would be painted black and fitted with the MTA logo. The 3 locomotives that would be actually overhauled was 4750, 4752, and 4753. These locomotives would mainly serve as replacements for the much older S motors at Harmon. In 1983, they would be sold off to Metro North Commuter, and all 3 locomotives would eventually be scrapped in 1998. The GG1 was an electric locomotive that really didn't need an introduction. They were an excellent locomotive, and the only time they ever failed was due to a nasty winter. By the start of the Conrail era, the GG1s would be close to 42 years old. To match the new owner, GG1s would be repainted in black and marked out with the CR marking, CR standing for Conrail. The very first GG1, 4800, the prototype of the GG1 class, would be special and be painted in the original bicentennial livery to celebrate 200 years of independence and founding of the United States. 4800 would also be special in the only GG1 to be painted in the Conrail blue scheme with the Canopina logo on the side. GG1s in general would remain on fast freight trains until they would be removed from service in 1979. Some would be preserved, such as 4800, for being special, for being the GG1 prototype. However, a majority of them would be scrapped. The E44s from Penn Central, Conrail would upgrade the rest of the E44s to have now silicon diodes. They would not feature any upgrades in terms of horsepower. This upgrade would make them more reliable and reduce chances of failure when it comes to the rectification equipment. One special E44, 4453, would be upgraded by Conrail in 1980, with new electronics, and be upgraded to 6,000 horsepower. It would be made redundant as Conrail would de-electrify their freight operations. Later, 4453 would be tested by GE in 1984, but it would also be scrapped, but with some components being reused on later locomotives. Conrail would make great use of the E44s, using them on slow drag service. However, they would suffer a similar fate to the rest of the electric fleet, with being taken off service due to Conrail discontinuing electric freight operations in 1981. A majority of the E44s would be sold for scrap. However, 8 E44s would end up with New Jersey Transit, never being used, with one final E44 4465 ending up being preserved. The older but smaller brothers to the E44, the E33. The E33 would be built in 1955 to 1957. They would be built in a batch of 12, and they would have, just like their name suggests, 3,300 horsepower. They would end up having multiple owners, wearing the livery of the Virginian, the Norfolk and Western, the New Haven, Penn Central, and finally their last owner, Conrail. An easy way to distinguish the E33s from the E44s was simply the pantograph. The E33 would use a diamond-shaped pantograph instead of the favorably single-arm pantograph used on the E44s. The E33s would have a relatively quiet life on the Conrail, where they would be repainted into the blue Conrail livery with the can opener logo. They would be used on fast freight duties just like the GG1s and be retired when de-electrification started in March 1981. In the end, only 2 out of the 10 at Conrail would survive and enter preservation, with the rest being scrapped. The S motors would have an incredibly long career at this point, originally being built at the start of the century, originally being mainline engines, and now being relegated to being switcher locomotives moving coaches around Grand Central Terminal. They would finally be retired in 1981 when the E10Bs had finally taken over their jobs, meaning that the 75-year-old locomotives would finally meet their end. If you are wanting to find out more about the S-motor, I'll give a link in the description for the New York Central video, but that is all we have time for today. Thank you for your continued support, and it's seriously appreciated. I hope I can always make content that you guys watch and enjoy. I hope to see you at next week's video about the early years of British Railways electrification. We'll go through the 1955 electrification scheme all the way to crew. So don't forget to like this video, and I just want to say thank you from me, my partner, and my pet rabbit, Mr. Morris.